And I say this because when it comes to numbers, when we look at baseball or football or basketball and we think of the greatest athletes of all time, if you were to divide them up into the numbers that they actually play with, and this is why I call this one by the numbers, Tony Gwynn is the best to ever wear the number 19 of all sports athletes ever. How do you feel about that, James? When you think of all the athletes who have ever worn past, present, we can't go future because we don't have a time machine. But if you think of past and present, Tony Gwynn, is he the best one to ever wear the number 19? Are you in or out?
I'd have to say that again. I think I'm out on this one.
Okay.
Tony Gwynn, when you look at his career, he's got the numbers. He's got what point? Well, he's got the 338 batting average. He's got over 3,000 hits. He's a left-handed, so I feel like I'm betraying a fellow lefty on this take. But throughout the history of sports, there is one guy that comes to mind, and for a lot of newer generation, they may not know, but for those that do, that have followed the game of football, when you think number 19, you think of Johnny U, Johnny Unitas for the Baltimore Colts back in the day. I mean, this was a guy who he was, in a sense, the Peyton Manning of his day, or you could say Peyton Manning was the Johnny Unitas of his day. This was a guy who, at the line of scrimmage, was the best quarterback for his time. I mean, Johnny Unitas, he pretty much the forward pass that was his bread and butter at a time where football was 3 yards in a cloud of dust from running the ball all the time. I mean, if you go back and look at some of his numbers, he was posting 3,000-yard seasons back in the 50s and 60s. Like, if memory serves me correct, I think his single highest ever passing rating, his single highest ever passing yards for a season was 3,481 yards. That came in 1963. And that's comparable to some quarterbacks that play in the NFL today. And he threw that for a season back in 1963 on only about 50% passing completion. If you tie that into nowadays where guys are hitting 60, 70% of their passes, you're talking about he could have had nearly about another 1,000 yards, about a 4,400-yard season. So, I mean, when I think of number 19, man, I'd have to go with Johnny Unitas. He's got the stats, he's got the nostalgia, and he's also got the wins. He's got NFL championships before the Super Bowl, and then he also won a Super Bowl himself. So, I mean, I got to go with Johnny Unitas, greatest number 19 there was.
You hit it right on the head, and I agree with you on this. I'm out on this as well. And I tell you what, it was tough. Even though it's not, it seems like on paper it's not. It kind of was, because when you say Tony Gwynn, the best ever to wear the number 19, and then you go do your homework, and you see Johnny U, like Tony Gwynn was almost as big to the sport of baseball as Johnny U was to football. When you really look into it, the difference is that Johnny U's got a championship, or has championships before Super Bowl as well, but has won the big ones in NFL where Tony Gwynn couldn't, as a team, because Johnny U was at the quarterback position, was more able to lead it as a captain. And that's when you talk about like Peyton Manning and stuff like that. Peyton Manning molded his game after Johnny U. Even though he looked up to his father, he looked at other quarterbacks. And another one he even said throughout early on in his career was he looked at Johnny U. That's why he wanted to come to Indianapolis. That's why he wanted to be a Colt and to add on to that legacy for the Colts franchise. So that's why I have to agree with you on the fact that Johnny U is number 19. There's also another quarterback, famous quarterback, 4 Super Bowls award number 19 for a couple of years for the Chiefs, and that was Joe Montana. So that's why, even though he only wore it for 2 years, he's even above Tony Gwynn, because he had 4 Super Bowls, man, and was a legend for San Francisco. So that's why you got to have Joe Montana, or according to the guy on the water board, Joe Montana, have him at 1, and then Johnny Unitas, those 2 up there, to have him in there above Tony Gwynn. So even though I love Tony Gwynn and I love what he did for baseball and having 3,000 hits, and me being a big guy, being a little bit fluffy myself, it's good to be able to see somebody of big size and big girth be able to play baseball, to be a role model to the younger generation as well, like the Prince Fielders and Cecil Fielders and stuff like that, like the father-son
CC
duo.
Sabathia.
CC Sabathia, you might not see these bigger guys in the game if it wasn't for someone like Tony Gwynn. And Tony Gwynn played outfield, and you have to be athletic to play outfield, and played his entire career in the NL. So I'm saying all this stuff was tough, but what separates him from the others is he didn't get a championship, and I can't give it to him for that.
Sertoba Media, where the struggle is real to be awesome.